involved. There was strangulation involved. It was not supposed to go as far as it did, but it did. I don't distinguish between murder and anything else. She died, I did it. What else you want to know?
This is Charlie Manson kind of stuff. What's going on here?
We have been told that you can grant wishes, and the wishes that you can grant have to be paid for with a life. I can't make that up.
And me and Bailey have killed several people.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting concept. Trust me, you've never had a conversation with a guy like me.
Sydney Loof was meeting up for a date with someone she met online and hasn't been seen since. She was last heard from last Wednesday when she sent a photo on Snapchat. It was captioned, "Ready for my date."
Good morning, Lincoln and Omaha and probably several other places. This is Aubrey Trail and this is Bailey Boswell. We've spent the last few days watching ourselves being slammed and crucified in the newspapers and the news and everything else, so we thought it was time we had our say. The Lincoln Police Department will have you believe that I'm still just a criminal running around. But you know, as far as I know, I'm not wanted for anything. I mean, naturally, I can't go home now because my house has been swarmed, searched, and I'm being looked for.
The most unusual thing about it is it's almost like they're holding their own press conference. Their choice to go public and then use like a social media broadcast sort of to do it, rather than getting an attorney and going in and talking to the police. They're going to speak directly to the public and say, we're just innocent and we're being maligned. And with psychopathy, it's usually linked to that sense of they're going to be in control. They're not going to let someone else send information out or control the message. They want to have a say to control our attention and what we think about them.
Bailey here is going to tell you about her 2 dates with Sydney, and we'll go from there.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bailey, Audrey on Tinder, and a few other names because I have warrants, but this really isn't about me. This is about Sydney. And I'm just kind of want to tell you what I've already told the Lincoln police more than one time. I met her. We drove around Lincoln, smoked weed, had a great time, and she asked me to drop her off at a friend's house, so I did so. I mean, I haven't heard from her since.
Boswell has like the hood up and the big, almost glamour Hollywood glasses. She doesn't seem to want to show her full face and say, I'm an innocent person. So it might be in the vein of creating an image like Bonnie and Clyde or something. I just think it's odd if they're getting online to clear their name and then to be so covered up.
I really don't even know what else to say. I guess I just want the family to know that I'm truly sorry and I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl. I don't know. Babe, do you have anything else to say?
They're chasing us around like dogs. I wish the family the best. I wish Sydney the best. But as far as the police department, you.
Yeah.
Have you sit right over there? All right, let's party. We want to make sure you know why you're here. I think based upon us looking at the Facebook stuff, the videos, it's pretty clear, but you never know. Sometimes people say say one thing when they're on a video camera and another thing it's like,
No. Go ahead.
So at some point, somebody's going to ask us what you think. Because we flew down here from Lincoln this morning. We're going to spend as much time as we need to with you.
Okay.
But what I think comes down to what I know. I can't say I know a whole lot about you. I know what I can read in the NCIC reports and the intelligence reports coming out of jail and what some of the girls have told us and stuff like that. But I'd like to talk to you a bit about how you're raised and who raised you and kind of work through that. I'd be happy to tell you about myself too a little bit if you want to, but it's important for me to understand who you are. I'd like to give kind of an idea of who you are, where you've been, what you're about, so I kind of understand, because this conversation that we're about to have, I mean, there's a ton of people that are hanging on it, but what's more important to me is who you are.
Where do you want to start?
You start wherever you feel comfortable.
I was born in Manchester, Tennessee. Never graduated high school. Got in trouble when I was 17. Me and a friend had a wonderful idea to rob a motel with a BB gun. And I spent the next 11 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. I've been out of prison for 2.5 years. I own an antique business, so internet pretty much worldwide. In trouble most of my life, crook most of my life. No reason for it. If you're profiling or something, I didn't have a bad childhood. I wasn't abused. I chose to be a criminal. I mean, no excuses. It's just what I chose to be.
Aubrey Trail's criminal history includes a variety of crimes, a variety of categories of crimes, and with psychopathic individuals, one of the factors that we look at is what we call criminal versatility. While Trail told police that he was into the business of dealing and trading antiques, what we actually know is that while he was selling antiques, he was stealing those antiques and then putting them on the market. He was stealing gold coins and other coins of value and then selling those.
Something that's really important about psychopaths is they get immense pleasure from deceiving others. Conning others makes them feel great. Why? Because they feel superior, grandiose, they can lord it over you. When Aubrey comes and he says, let's party, it's extremely foolish. He's not taking this seriously, and he's glib and arrogant.
You ready to roll?
No, I got something for y'all. Y'all want something from me, I want something from y'all.
what do you want?
Do not judge me on my past. Do not look at my history and find me guilty already. Listen to what I have to say and investigate what I tell you. Here's how this will work.
Okay.
If you would like answers to your questions, me and Bailey will be in Wilbur County Jail tomorrow night. If I'm not back in Wilbur tomorrow, this conversation is over. Bailey's not going to ever say a word to you.
At this point, it's been 2 weeks since Sydney Loof went missing. Investigators have no leads. They're talking to Trail, trying to identify if this girl is even alive. But Trail's not worried about anything related to Sydney Loof. He is making attempts to control the interview. He's making attempts to control the investigation, and he's actually confident and arrogant enough to think he can negotiate with the detectives about where he's transferred, what happens to Bailey Boswell, what time frame those decisions need to be made in, and very confidently and smugly just says to them, this interview's over if that doesn't happen. With Sydney Loof, he's not concerned about her well-being, but he is using her as a pawn to negotiate his own terms.
I'd like to back up a little bit, if you don't mind, and talk about, because this relationship with Bailey is fairly unique.
I mean, I love her to death. I met Bailey over a year ago. How I met her doesn't really matter. But her and I hit it off. She was in a really bad situation. She has a stalker boyfriend, ex-boyfriend. Bailey is bisexual, you need to know that. Bailey likes females as much as she likes guys. I won't go into graphic details of our sex life and all that.
I need you to, unnecessary.
Because some of our stuff leans towards the extreme and Not in a violent, extreme way, but with toys and like that, you know. So there's a lot of role playing, dominant, submissive stuff.
The way Aubrey Trail talks about Bailey Boswell is this impression management that he's a hero, that will protect her, and he's very noble, and he's a good guy. And when you see this kind of age difference and you see dominant submission activities, that's typically a power imbalance. And the power imbalance can manifest in different ways, but it is an odd pairing that suggests something's not right.
While there isn't that much known about Bailey Boswell, in part because Trail had instructed her not to talk to law enforcement, it's important to note that the way those two met was Boswell actually posted an ad on a defunct sex site looking for a sugar daddy, and Trail responded. So the beginnings of their relationship as a couple was mutually transactional, and that gives us a little bit more information about Bailey Boswell, that she's maybe not this damsel in distress. She may not be this young female who has just been victimized, but herself has a more psychopathic presentation in that she's willing to use people, and she knows what she needs out of people, and she doesn't want a whole lot more.
We're going to talk about some of the girls that have started to come forward, if that's all right with you.
That's good.
Okay.
The information that we have is that you're kind of some all-powerful sort of fella. You're a spiritual type person.
Every one of the girls that we've talked to so far, they all said the same stuff. This is Charlie Manson kind of stuff. What's going on here?
We have been told that you can grant wishes, and the wishes that you can grant have to be paid for with a life. I can't make that up.
And me and Bailey have killed several people.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting concept. Trust me, you've never had a conversation with a guy like me. And it's no brag or boast. I don't really need to impress you. I don't need to impress anybody. And maybe what they're saying is true. I'm not saying it's not.
One of the things we talk about when we think of psychopathy is the cat and mouse, so the toying with people. He's going to say some very provocative things and then back away from some of the comments, and he's enjoying it. He's leaning back and relaxed. He's in charge of the interview at that particular point. The more we learn about him, it sounds like he was able to lure women in who either needed money or they liked some drugs, and he would invite them into his sphere where he seems to be the only dominant male and then is the provider, the grantor of wishes. It looks like a recruitment, seduction, and grooming sort of pattern where he's got Bailey Boswell helping him find women online and then to bring them over.
What we're trying to figure out is we got a missing girl, right? And the last person that was seen with Sydney was Bailey.
And a lot of other girls with us for long periods of time. But guess what? None of them are missing. Nothing's happened to any of them. Explain. I can't tell you what this girl is because I don't know where she is.
Could you bring me to where Sydney Luth is right now?
At this very minute? No, I'm not sure where she's at right this very minute. So the answer would be no. Can I point you in the right direction? Absolutely.
Do you know whether or not she's alive or dead?
No. I would just say that I'm assuming she's alive.
You're gonna tell me something? I'll tell you something.
Okay, you tell me that now and I'll tell you something else.
No, you're full of I'm not even full of Never full of okay.
Can't guarantee you. What I would have told you was a lot more important than what you would have told me.
After more than 2 weeks of endless searching for a missing Lincoln woman, her family took to Facebook to announce the news. The body of 24-year-old Sydney Loof has been recovered.
Police say her body had been dismembered and scattered across multiple rural sites 100 miles outside Lincoln. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell are now prime suspects in her murder.
Hello, Matt. Hello, Mike. Hi, Aubrey. I'd like to think that y'all came all this way just because you like me. That's probably not true. You're pulling your hair out. Don't trust these barbers. You know, I got to keep y'all good looks. You been.
At this point in the investigation, Aubrey Trail has been transferred, and the same detectives have gone out to see him in Kansas. He comes in, he's social, he's pleasant, he's glib. And what we don't see is somebody who's stressed, he's not worried, he's not concerned about the fact that he is still very much under suspicion for the murder of Sydney Loof.
He's joking. We call that superficial charm in psychopathy because he doesn't really have a relationship with them. He is inappropriately making jokes. That's not why they're there to see him. But he's making light of it. And people with psychopathy do that. He's playing with them.
You know that I killed her. So unequivocally, you are taking responsibility. You're saying what about Sydney Loof's death? I am saying that I did it. The day she came to our house, Sydney was offered, shall we say, a fantasy to make money. She was given $5,000. And in the process of this fantasy, Sydney died. You know how Sydney died. Sydney was strangled. Who strangled her? I did. What instrument was used to strangle her? Extension cord. Who else was in the room while she was having sex and being strangled? That you'll never know. I will tell you no name. Okay? You get what I promised from the beginning, a life for a life.
Trail is not willing to talk about any real details. Why he killed her, who was in the room. Trail is still trying to control and steer the investigation. He's getting in front of what he thinks is the train and trying to make sure that Bailey Boswell is not implicated, to make sure that these other females that they pulled into this violent sex ring are not implicated.
If this does go to trial, are you gonna put them on the stand? I'm not gonna tell you who we're gonna put on the stand and not put on the stand. You know the answer to that question already. Work with me here. I ask because I don't want it to turn into a circus and a carnival. I don't ask for my sake. I want you to put them on the stand. And you can read into that anything you want to read into it. Okay. Let me guess. This is how this worked. The first one, the Omaha cops talked to her. She said, oh God, Bailey's killed 7 or 8 people. Oh, he's a vampire. He's from the 15 or 1600s and they like crazy stuff. And is that the gist of the conversation? Yeah. Now put them on the stand and see what they say.
This is definitely the power play. He's pushing to find out what else they know, like who are you going to put on the stand? And they're going, we're not going to tell you. And then he moves to a different strategy, which is, you don't want the families to go through the circus of hearing all the details again. So he's saying, I'm trying to be considerate. But in fact, what he's doing in the interview itself is still throwing out emotionally provocative material without filling in any detail. So the psychopath is saying, I'm smarter than these people, I can run circles around them, so I'm going to tell you how this is going to go.
Get the feeling like we're here so you can figure out whether or not we've got any cards in our hands, and that ain't gonna happen.
So why haven't y'all charged me with murder? As much information as you have. I mean, I'm just curious. I'm just curious. I don't like the stress, I don't like the headaches, I'm not a very patient person.
You've got what you got. What do you need? I mean, whatever's gonna be charged, I want charged. I want, let's do it, let's get it done.
Okay, so when we get what I call a confession from people, because there's a lot of people that say this is a confession, but who, the what, the when, the where, that's when
I thought you had all that.
you're playing cat and
No,
mouse.
I'm not playing with anybody. I don't play games.
Despite Trail saying he's not playing games with the detectives, it's really obvious that he is. If he really wanted this whole thing to be over, the simple solution would have been to give them a very clear and detailed answer about how he lured Sydney in, what happened the night she was murdered, who dismembered her body and disposed of it, who was a witness to it, and why they went on the run. But Aubrey Trail isn't giving them any of that information.
I said, I did it. What more do you want? But back to your questions. You found Sydney's body in bags. Yeah, you're missing 2 small ones.
What was in those 2 small ones?
The soul
Okay.
and the blood.
So if you don't mind me asking, how do you put a soul in a bag?
Let's talk about that another time. It's just it's
So what?
a belief, I guess. It's a belief.
Okay.
I mean, one day soon you'll find that I'm not delusional. I'm not totally insane. I can't make that, like you told me, I can't make that up.
There is breaking news tonight, and it is major, in the death and disappearance of Nebraska woman Sydney Loof. First-degree murder charges have been lodged against Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell. There they are right there. You recall, Loof set up an online date with Bailey Boswell, then went missing for days.
So, we're here to have a little chat with you, obviously, Aubrey.
Yeah.
I dreamed of it. Here's my only thing, Aubrey, is this. It's kind of a moving target with you, and I get it. I always love making the FBI chase their tails, you know. You said on a number of occasions that charge you and you'll tell us. So, you've been charged with first-degree murder of Sydney Loof. Number 15. Is Bailey been over?
Yes.
Same thing?
Yes, same thing.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing we want to know is the truth, because what you just gave us was a little.
Sydney Loof went out with Bailey 14th. They got high, smoked weed. The next day, Bailey went and picked Sydney up. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. I don't remember. Sydney came back to our house. I offered Sydney a large amount of money, $5,000 cash, which I gave her to participate in 2 of the girls' fantasies. In the process, Sydney Loof died.
I don't think we can totally believe anything he's saying. And the version that he's maintaining, that there was this autoerotica scenario and he accidentally strangled Sydney Loof, just doesn't add up. The detectives aren't buying this. They now know, with the evidence that's continued to come out, that this was a far more elaborate, calculated, and premeditated scheme, and that Sydney Loof essentially never had a chance the minute she walked into the clutches of Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell.
There was lots of violent sex involved. There was strangulation involved. It was not supposed to go as far as it did, but it did. I don't distinguish between murder and anything else. She died, I did it. What else you want to know?
He obviously gets pleasure from deceiving people. He gets pleasure from exploiting women's bodies. And he must get excitement or thrill from hurting women and humiliating them. So he's, a sexual psychopath. And part of that is enjoying hurting them and killing them.
So at 10:35 in the morning, you bought 2 packages of DeWalt hacksaw blades. Why are you buying a hacksaw?
I don't know. Didn't buy anything to cut anybody up with the next step.
The problem is this, Bobby, is that these items that are being bought in the morning and the afternoon before Sid dies are used in disposing of her body. We'll do it. It's called planning. Oh. You disagree? So the trash bag Bailey Boswell lies are found out at the scene where Sidney Luce's body is. Okay. I'm looking at this saying, they're out buying all of the stuff that they're going to use to dispose of a body before the poor girl is dead. Does it not look weird, huh?
After making the date appointment, Bailey Boswell and Trail went to the store to buy the bleach, the bags, the tarp, even the sauna outfits. So this was not, as Aubrey Trail has described it, as an accident that happened during a sex film. When you look at all the details, this is a team that worked on finding young women, getting them into that circle, and they were actually planning ahead of time to kill them and dismember their body. And Bailey Boswell is not an innocent player in this. She is a female psychopath and is as callous as Aubrey Trail. It's easier to think of Aubrey Trail, a man, as the significant psychopath in this story, but I think she's an equal player because she had to go out and get the victims and she knew what she was doing and it didn't bother her.
Let's swing back to the sex fantasy. Let's do that. How'd you set it up with Sidney?
Cash. I said, well, if you be willing to do it now. And eventually she agreed to it. The last thing that Sidney Luke ever said to me is, will I be okay? And I said, yes. And I did kill Sidney Luke. All this you're trying to prove is irrelevant. The girl's dead. And do you really want to put this family through this again? Because I don't.
One of the interesting dynamics that emerges in this version of Trail's story is that he essentially is acting as a It's the ultimate act of disregard for another human being because it is human trafficking. You are making money off the acts of somebody else. Parasitic lifestyles are something that we oftentimes see with psychopathic offenders. That pimp lifestyle is consistent with what we see with parasitic behavior.
It was somebody else's fantasy that was getting paid for.
Yes.
You got paid 15 grand to set it up.
Yeah.
And then out of that 15, Sidney gets 5.
Yes.
So you get to keep 10.
Yes.
And so then the sex acts happen in your place and she dies in the bedroom.
That's true.
Tell me what about it.
The body was cut up because our apartment, have you been there? Across the street, there's an apartment where 4 or 5 families live. There was no way I could get her out into a vehicle without 30 people seeing it.
How did you cut that body up without there being a huge mess?
Let's say we were very thirsty that day.
Okay, so you drank a bunch of blood. Then please take me through how you drank all of her blood.
No, not all. I'm just right?
He wants to be Charles Manson, where he can be looked up to and almost like worshipped. He's like a cult leader. He has these women he's lured into the house. He calls them his girls. Manson had an entourage of women around him that were dependent on him. So he's created his little world where these women need him, he supports them. It's entirely possible that this belief system that he's talking about is something that helped them think about him in a greater than human sort of way. Like he's a vampire, he's a warlock, he's special. But I think it's a narrative that's used to control other people rather than reflecting something he believes in, like a religious belief.
How did you carry the blood? Was it in a container? Was it in a bag?
That is going to verge too much on the freaky. So
We're pretty good. We can handle it.
3 of us, not Bailey Boswell, cup of coffee. And then the balance was put into the container and at the proper spot in a place. It was poured over that spot. The cemetery in Clay County, it's a very sacred place to us. And in our beliefs, it's very important. What you found was 6 parts. She was laid as she was because we believe in that position, and because of what's missing from her, that she will come back quicker.
Okay.
We're of the belief of reincarnation with a twist.
The whole story of this ritual feels very shallow, very glib, and disingenuous. A large part of psychopathy, and we see this very clearly here, is the intense narcissism, the grandiosity, the need for admiration. Now, if you think about this guy, Aubrey Trail, he's not good looking by most standards. He's not particularly charismatic by most standards. He is not particularly intelligent by most standards. So how do you lure vulnerable women if you're not charismatic, talented, or intelligent? And so in his narcissism, he creates a cult to enrich himself, but also to make himself feel really important so that he could be worshipped as this powerful vampire and then abuse girls and exploit them.
The cemetery's up here, and where I'd chosen for her to lay is here. And we stopped as we drove. I could put it where and lay it where I wanted it to go. The head was put here.
Mm-hmm.
She agreed to participate.
Okay.
Their fantasy was to bring someone to the brink, and she knew there would be violent sex involved.
Okay.
She knew there would be pain.
Okay. So, one person unknown is having sex, right?
Right.
And then you were in front of her using extension cord. What's the other person?
Watching her eyes. I'm standing, pulling.
Okay.
Here, trying to see her eyes.
Okay.
As they come in and out. I know it's a freaky thing, man.
Yeah.
90% of the girls that you meet are either on drugs, or thieves themselves, or running from the law, or have warrants, and don't have a lot of money. $5,000 is a lot of money to them, you know?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot they won't do.
Trail's not taking responsibility for how he's exploiting these women. He's actually admitting to the fact that he looks for disenfranchised, down on their luck females who have addiction issues, who have psychological instability, who are essentially vulnerable and needy. And he preys on them. And he doesn't see it that way, and like some psychopaths, he's just failing to take responsibility for any part of this. What we see is a real disregard for women. There isn't any regret or remorse for what he's done.
I love all my girls. I love every one of them. But they love my money. They love what I can do for them.
Well, but the money's not there now.
So
does that love go away?
Of course it does. Of course it does. Everything in this world is based on money.
talking openly about how he needed to use these young women to enrich himself. It does feel honest, but he's also bragging. Look at me, I'm such a straight shooter. I'm telling you the truth. I love money because you're a hypocrite and you won't admit it. He's arguing that these relationships are transactional, but it's not, it's exploitative. Transactional, both parties know exactly what they're getting into. Most relationships with psychopaths are exploitative.
You're not going to convict Bailey Boswell for something she did not do.
Well,
Bailey wanted to be a part of something so bad, but I would not let Bailey cross that line because it's too addictive. It's like crack cocaine. The lifestyle is scary at times, but it's an adrenaline rush from hell. I knew this had the potential of going bad, and I still let it go through because I was greedy. It was way too dangerous. It was dangerous, and I knew it. We had a discussion, and the subject come up that maybe Bailey should just be gone. You know, maybe she should just disappear with everybody else.
But you disappear with everybody else.
Maybe Bailey should be killed. A girl's dead, you're dead. You participated in it. You were there. You looked at murder. We're discussing how to get rid of a dead body. And your girlfriend ain't helped at all, and she knows everything about it. Is she gonna go down for murder with us? What do we do?
We often wonder, can a psychopath fall in love, right? I think the answer to that is kind of. I think that psychopaths can become very attached to people because they are useful, that they're as useful as your favorite pair of shoes, your favorite car. It's useful. You like how it runs. It gets you there. And I think in some way, Bailey Boswell was useful to Trail. And it might have been because she generated good business, that she turned out to be really good at recruiting women online and bringing more women into his cult. If Trail has a goal of trying to have Bailey Boswell charged with a lesser crime, he's got a plan. There's a plan on his mind about what he needs her for in the future, because I don't think that she means anything more to him than any of the money.
Prosecutors called 3 females in their early 20s to testify. All talked about having sexual encounters, being controlled, and told that they were part or could be part of the 12 to 13 girls in Trail's witchcraft covenant. Trail claimed he was a vampire with special powers. The first said Trail and Boswell told them she'd have to kill to fully become a witch.
Bailey is innocent and I curse you all.
In the middle of court, Aubrey Trail, on trial for the first-degree murder of Sidney Louf, actually slashed his throat.
Trail snuck a razor into court. He sliced his neck, and was nothing other than more strategy and gameplay. While media reported that he slashed his throat, it was far less dramatic than that. He took a razor blade and sliced his neck superficially. The fact that Trail chose to do that, there's no doubt that that was a manipulative act to simply try and derail the trial.
now, I have never told the truth about how and why Sydney died. Once I sat Sydney down and started explaining how we made money, some of our criminal activities, and about the group sex and other things, Sydney somewhat freaked out. The truth is, I killed Sydney because of her reaction to what I had told her. I have always told the truth when I said Bailey was not in the bedroom when I killed Sydney.
I don't think it occurs to him to even pretend to be remorseful, because what he's much more motivated by, what is his driving impulse, is to hold an audience, to be admired, to be seen as successful, to be seen as dangerous.
One witness testified that, quote, Trail and Boswell talked about murder and torture often. Quote, she mainly talked about dismembering people, breaking fingernails, breaking fingers, and that when Bailey described various torture methods, she was, quote, joyful. She would smile and giggle. Her eyes would light up almost.
I guess I just want the family to know that I'm truly sorry and I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
At that point when that video is made, they know that Sydney Loof is dead. They know that they've dismembered her. They know that they've disposed of her body parts. And if Trail is to be believed, they know they drank her blood. They know they disposed of her organs. They know that they obstructed the investigative process. And the two of them are doing that together.
Bailey Boswell is not the innocent victim in this whole story. Although Aubrey Trail wants to paint her in that light, he wants to describe her as she'd been victimized by an abusive, stalking boyfriend, and he's rescued her. To be clear, she's...
April 19th, 2020. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the forests and winding roads of Nova Scotia. It should have been an ordinary Sunday morning. The kind of morning where fishermen prepared their boats before sunrise, where retired couples brewed coffee in quiet kitchens, where nurses finished night shifts and looked forward to returning home, where families, trapped indoors by the uncertainty of a global pandemic, searched for comfort in routines that suddenly felt precious. But scattered across rural communities, hidden behind rows of trees and long gravel driveways, something unimaginable had already happened. Some homes would never wake up again. Some phones would ring forever without being answered. Some families were about to learn that the last conversation they had with a loved one had already happened, and they simply didn't know it yet. Across Nova Scotia, police vehicles rushed down empty roads. Emergency lights flashed against dark forests. Officers spoke over radios with voices that grew increasingly strained. The situation made no sense. At first, reports suggested a shooting. Then multiple shootings. Then fires. Then bodies. Then more bodies. The numbers kept rising. The locations kept changing. And somewhere out there, moving through the province like a shadow, was a man nobody seemed able to stop. A man who looked exactly like a police officer. Imagine standing in your front yard on a quiet Sunday morning. You see a patrol car approaching. You notice the familiar red and blue markings. The emergency lights. The uniform. The badge. Everything appears normal. Everything appears safe. You might wave. You might walk closer. You might assume the officer is there to warn you about danger. But what if the danger was sitting behind the wheel? What if the person wearing the uniform wasn't a police officer at all? What if the face behind that windshield belonged to a killer? That terrifying question would haunt Canada for years. Because during the deadliest mass shooting in modern Canadian history, trust itself became a weapon. The man at the center of this nightmare was 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman. To many people who knew him, he appeared successful. He owned businesses. He possessed expensive vehicles. He enjoyed collecting property. He could be charming when he wanted to be. The kind of person who entered a room and immediately demanded attention. But beneath that carefully maintained image was a darker reality that many people would only fully understand after it was too late. Long before the killings, stories circulated about his temper. Stories about intimidation. Stories about controlling behavior. Stories that often remained hidden behind closed doors. Like many future disasters, the warning signs existed. They simply failed to come together in a way that forced action. Then, during a single horrifying weekend in April 2020, everything exploded. The violence began in a small rural community called Porter Peak. Nestled along the Bay of Fundy, Porter Peak was the kind of place where people knew one another. A place of cottages, wooded properties, and quiet roads. A place where neighbors waved as they drove past. A place where residents often left their doors unlocked. The isolation that made the community peaceful would soon become one of its greatest vulnerabilities. That Saturday evening, most people were doing what millions around the world were doing during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. They were staying home, watching television, calling family members, trying to adapt to a world that already felt uncertain. Nobody could have imagined that another threat was quietly emerging among them. As darkness settled over Porter Peak, an argument erupted. The details would later reveal a history of domestic violence and control. The confrontation became physical. The woman involved managed to escape. That decision would save her life. In the hours that followed, she would become one of the most important witnesses in understanding what happened next. But at that moment, she wasn't thinking about investigations. She wasn't thinking about courtrooms. She wasn't thinking about history. She was simply trying to survive. Behind her, something far more dangerous than a domestic dispute had begun. Investigators would later piece together a chilling sequence of events. Fueled by rage, Gabriel Wortman armed himself. He gathered weapons. He prepared for destruction. Then he transformed himself. Not into a fugitive. Not into a man attempting to flee. But into something far more disturbing. He dressed as a police officer. The uniform wasn't a crude imitation. It wasn't a Halloween costume. It closely resembled the appearance of a genuine member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Even more shocking, he possessed a vehicle carefully modified to resemble an RCMP patrol car. The deception was detailed, intentional, calculated, and incredibly dangerous. Because uniforms carry power. They carry authority. They create instant trust. Most people are conditioned from childhood to view a police officer as someone who can help. Someone who can protect. Someone who can be approached during moments of fear. Gabriel Wortman understood that. And according to investigators, he exploited that trust with devastating effectiveness. As the night progressed, gunfire shattered the silence of Porter Peak. Homes became crime scenes. Vehicles burned. Flames illuminated the darkness. The smell of smoke drifted through the community. Residents who heard strange noises often struggled to understand what they were hearing. A gunshot can sound different in rural areas. It can be mistaken for something else. A vehicle backfiring. Construction. Fireworks. Many people could not immediately comprehend that multiple murders were taking place around them. And while confusion spread among residents, the killer kept moving. One location. Then another. Then another. The violence unfolded across a landscape of forests, roads, homes, and isolated properties. Hours passed. The death toll increased. Yet even as police responded, they faced a situation unlike anything they had encountered before. The suspect wasn't hiding. He wasn't barricaded. He wasn't remaining in one location. He was mobile. Unpredictable. And he looked like one of them. That single fact complicated everything. Imagine receiving a report about an armed suspect dressed exactly like a police officer. Imagine trying to warn frightened residents while also ensuring they don't mistake a real officer for the killer. Imagine searching roads where every approaching police vehicle suddenly becomes a potential threat. The nightmare wasn't only physical. It was psychological. Every assumption about safety was being dismantled. Every familiar symbol was becoming uncertain. Throughout the night and into the following day, the scale of the catastrophe remained unclear. Authorities knew something terrible was happening. But they did not yet know how terrible. Each new discovery revealed another victim. Another family. Another life interrupted forever. And while the tragedy unfolded, many residents slept. Some had no idea a murderer was traveling through nearby communities. Some would wake to shocking news alerts. Others would awaken to police knocking on their doors. Still others would never wake at all. The province was entering one of the darkest days in its history. By morning, the violence had spread beyond Port-au-Peak. Roads that usually carried only local traffic became corridors of fear. Communities separated by miles suddenly found themselves connected by a common threat. Witnesses reported sightings. Police raced from one lead to another. Emergency dispatchers struggled to manage a flood of information. The killer remained ahead of them. For ordinary citizens, the situation felt almost impossible to comprehend. Mass shootings were not supposed to happen here. Not on this scale. Not in communities like these. Canada often viewed itself differently from the violence frequently associated with headlines elsewhere. Many residents of Nova Scotia had spent their entire lives believing that something like this belonged to another place. Another country. Another reality. But reality had arrived at their doorstep. And it was carrying a rifle. As the hours passed, a question emerged over and over again. Why? Why were these people targeted? Why had this happened? Why had a successful middle-aged man launched an attack of such unimaginable brutality? Those questions would dominate investigations, inquiries, documentaries, news reports, and countless conversations around kitchen tables for years. Some answers would emerge. Others would remain frustratingly incomplete. Because understanding evil is rarely straightforward. Human beings often search for a single explanation. A single moment. A single cause. But the truth is usually far messier. A web of choices. A history of behaviors. Warning signs ignored. Systems that fail. People who look away. And finally, one catastrophic event that exposes everything at once. The story you are about to hear is not simply the story of a mass shooting. It is not merely a timeline of violence. It is the story of a province that woke up to horror. The story of families whose lives were divided forever into before and after. The story of a killer who weaponized trust. The story of investigators forced to untangle chaos spread across multiple crime scenes. The story of heroes, victims, survivors, mistakes, warnings, and unanswered questions. Most importantly, it is the story of 22 people who should have lived. 22 people who had plans for the future. People who expected to see another sunrise. People who never imagined that a man disguised as a protector would become the greatest threat they would ever face. Because on that April weekend, the quiet roads of Nova Scotia became the setting for a tragedy that would shock an entire nation. And before it was over, Canada would witness how quickly ordinary life can descend into unimaginable darkness. To understand how a single man was able to leave an entire province in fear, we first need to understand the place where this tragedy unfolded. Because the story of the Nova Scotia mass shooting did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence. The kind of silence that settles over coastal Canada in early spring. The kind that exists between distant waves rolling toward shore and wind moving through pine trees. The kind of silence that makes small communities feel protected from the chaos of the outside world. Nova Scotia sits on Canada's eastern coast, stretching into the Atlantic Ocean like a hand reaching toward Europe. It is a province known for rugged shorelines, fishing villages, dense forests, and generations of families who have lived there for decades. Life often moves at a slower pace than in Canada's major cities. People recognize one another in grocery stores. They wave to neighbors while driving down narrow roads. They know who lives in the house at the end of the lane because that family may have been there for 30 years. For many residents, that sense of familiarity is one of the greatest gifts of rural life. Trust is woven into everyday routines. Doors are sometimes left unlocked. Vehicles sit in driveways overnight. People stop to help strangers whose cars are stuck in snowbanks. Children ride bicycles down quiet roads without constant supervision. It is not that crime does not exist. It does. But violent crime on a massive scale feels distant. Something that happens somewhere else. Somewhere far away. By April of 2020, however, Nova Scotia was already living through an unusual period of uncertainty. The COVID-19 pandemic had transformed daily life across the world. Schools had closed. Businesses struggled to adapt. Families remained isolated inside their homes. Social gatherings disappeared almost overnight. The normal rhythms of life had been interrupted. For many people, the pandemic created an atmosphere of anxiety that lingered beneath the surface of every day. People worried about their health, their jobs, their aging parents, their children's futures. Yet despite those concerns, many communities in Nova Scotia still felt relatively safe. The province had reported far fewer pandemic cases than many larger regions. Residents continued to believe that while the world was experiencing turmoil, their small towns remained places where people looked after one another. Portapique was one of those places. Located along the northern shore of Nova Scotia, Portapique was not a large town in the traditional sense. It was more of a rural community spread across wooded properties and coastal land. The population was small. Many residents owned seasonal cottages. Others lived there year-round. Long driveways wound through forests. Homes sat far apart from one another. At night, darkness arrived completely. Without city lights, the stars often seemed brighter. Visitors frequently described the area as peaceful, remote, quiet. The sort of place where someone could spend an entire weekend listening to birds, ocean winds, and almost nothing else. But isolation has another side. When homes are separated by large distances, emergencies become more complicated. If a fire starts, help may take longer to arrive. If violence erupts, neighbors may not hear it immediately. If someone is in danger, there may be no witnesses nearby. These realities would become tragically important. The geography of Portapique would shape nearly every aspect of the events that followed. The community itself looked almost cinematic in spring. Tall trees framed winding roads. Patches of snow had largely disappeared by mid-April, replaced by damp earth and emerging greenery. The air carried traces of salt from nearby waters. Mornings often began with fog drifting across the landscape before sunlight slowly burned it away. For residents, it was home. Not perfect. Not wealthy. But familiar. And familiarity creates a powerful illusion. The illusion that tomorrow will look much like yesterday. That the people around us are who they appear to be. That danger announces itself clearly before arriving. Unfortunately, danger rarely follows those rules. As investigators later reconstructed the events leading up to the massacre, they discovered that the tragedy had roots extending far beyond one night. The story was not solely about a man who suddenly snapped. It involved years of behavior that many people had witnessed but struggled to fully understand. At the center stood Gabriel Wortman. On the surface, Wortman appeared successful. He operated a denture business. He owned multiple properties. He drove expensive vehicles. People who met him casually often described him as charismatic, confident, outgoing. The kind of individual who enjoyed attention and knew how to command a room. He could be generous. He could be friendly. He could be entertaining. Like many dangerous individuals, he understood how to create favorable first impressions. But first impressions are often incomplete. Behind the public image existed another side. Friends, acquaintances, and later witnesses described episodes of controlling behavior, intimidation, and anger. Stories emerged after the massacre that painted a more troubling portrait. Some people recalled seeing flashes of rage. Others described situations that made them uncomfortable. Several individuals later stated that they had observed behavior that suggested deep emotional volatility. Yet such stories often remained fragmented. One person knew one piece. Another knew something else. Nobody possessed the entire picture. And because the incidents occurred across different times and different relationships, no single event forced a collective reckoning. This phenomenon appears repeatedly in true crime cases. After a tragedy, warning signs suddenly seem obvious. Before a tragedy, those same signs often appear isolated. A troubling argument. An uncomfortable encounter. An angry outburst. A threat that is dismissed. A story that sounds exaggerated. Human beings naturally seek explanations that preserve normalcy. We want to believe disturbing behavior is temporary. That someone will calm down. That things are not as serious as they appear. Unfortunately, reality does not always reward that optimism. As years passed, Wortman cultivated interests that many found unusual. One of those interests involved policing. He reportedly admired aspects of law enforcement culture and authority. What might initially appear harmless would later take on terrifying significance. Because long before the murders, he had already begun assembling elements of the disguise that would eventually shock an entire country. He acquired police-style equipment. He obtained items resembling official RCMP gear. Most disturbingly, he transformed a vehicle into something that closely resembled a genuine Royal Canadian Mounted Police cruiser. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand the role of the RCMP in Canada. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are more than a police service. They are a national symbol. For generations, Canadians have associated the RCMP with authority, public service, and trust. Their image appears in tourism campaigns, history books, and cultural representations of Canada itself. The uniform carries enormous psychological weight. People instinctively recognize it. They trust it. They obey it. Wortman's decision to replicate that image was not random. It created an extraordinary advantage. A disguise unlike almost any other. A disguise capable of lowering defenses in an instant. Meanwhile, life continued across Nova Scotia. People went to work. Raised families. Planned retirements. Celebrated birthdays. Argued with spouses. Mowed lawns. Visited friends. The future seemed open and predictable. Among those living throughout the province were the individuals who would later become victims. Teachers who dedicated years to helping children learn. Healthcare workers who cared for strangers. Parents. Grandparents. Friends. Neighbors. People with hobbies, routines, and dreams. One of the most important lessons in understanding mass casualty events is remembering that victims are not statistics. A number can feel abstract. 22 sounds like data. But 22 individual lives represent thousands of relationships. Thousands of memories. Countless future moments that never happened. A missed anniversary. A graduation. A family reunion. A retirement trip. A phone call. A hug. A conversation. Every victim carried an entire world within them. And every death created a ripple that spread far beyond the immediate family. Long before anyone knew their names would appear in headlines, they were simply living ordinary lives. That ordinary quality is precisely what makes these stories so devastating. The victims were not preparing for danger. They were not entering a battlefield. They were not participating in high-risk activities. They were living inside communities that felt safe. The spring of 2020 also created unique circumstances that would influence the unfolding crisis. Because of pandemic restrictions, many people were spending more time at home than usual. Roads were quieter. Businesses operated differently. Social interactions were reduced. The world felt strange but manageable. Nobody could foresee how quickly that sense of stability would collapse. As evening approached on April 18th, residents across Portapique and neighboring communities settled into routines that seemed entirely normal. Some watched television. Some spoke with relatives. Some prepared for bed. Others enjoyed the calm atmosphere of a Saturday night. Outside, darkness slowly covered the forests and roads. The temperatures dropped. The stars emerged above the Atlantic coastline. There was nothing in the landscape itself to suggest that history was about to change. No warning visible in the sky. No sirens. No emergency alerts. Only the familiar stillness of rural Nova Scotia. Yet beneath that stillness, tensions were already building. A sequence of events had begun moving toward a catastrophic outcome. Within hours, homes would burn. Gunfire would echo through quiet communities. Families would be shattered. Police would launch one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history. And an entire nation would struggle to understand how such a tragedy could happen. But on that evening, none of those future headlines existed. There was only Nova Scotia. The ocean. The forests. The winding roads. The small communities connected by trust. And somewhere among them, a man carrying years of anger, control, violence, and hidden darkness. A man who was about to transform one of the most peaceful landscapes in Canada into a crime scene stretching across multiple communities. The setting was complete. The pieces were already in place. The victims were living their final ordinary hours. The killer was preparing for his deadly journey. And the quiet night air over Portapique carried no hint that by sunrise, Canada would be facing the deadliest mass shooting in its modern history. One of the most difficult challenges when telling the story of a mass casualty event is resisting the tendency to focus entirely on the killer. The headlines often do it. The documentaries sometimes do it. The public conversation frequently does it. A single name begins to dominate the narrative while the people whose lives were taken slowly fade into the background. But this story does not belong to Gabriel Wortman. Not really. His actions created the tragedy, but the true heart of this story belongs to the people whose futures were stolen. The teachers who would never enter a classroom again. The healthcare workers who would never finish another shift. The parents who would never see their children grow older. The friends who would never answer another phone call. The neighbors who would never wave from their driveways again. To understand the weight of what happened in Nova Scotia, we need to understand who these people were before they became victims. Because before they were names in newspaper articles, they were human beings living ordinary lives. And ordinary lives are often far more extraordinary than we realize. On the evening of April 18, 2020, nobody in Portapique or the surrounding communities considered themselves part of a future true crime story. They were simply living. Some were planning retirement projects. Some were enjoying quiet weekends. Some were working essential jobs during a global pandemic. Others were spending time with family members, unaware that their final memories together were quietly being created. Among those who would lose their lives were people who had spent decades building relationships inside their communities. People whose names immediately meant something to neighbors. The kind of people whose absence would be noticed instantly. The kind of people who leave empty spaces that cannot be filled. One of those individuals was Heather O'Brien. At 17 years old, Heather represented something that every community treasures: possibility. She was young. Her future still stretched far ahead. The chapters of her life had barely begun. When people imagine victims of mass violence, they often picture statistics or headlines. What they do not picture are unfinished dreams. The college plans that never happen. The future friendships never formed. The careers never pursued. The families never created. A 17-year-old victim embodies all of those lost possibilities at once. Somewhere in her room there may have been plans for the future. Ideas. Goals. Things she hoped to accomplish. Perhaps conversations about where life might lead next. Like every teenager, she was standing at the beginning of adulthood, looking toward possibilities she believed would still be waiting tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Then there were the healthcare workers. At a moment when the world was struggling through the uncertainty of COVID-19, medical professionals had become symbols of resilience and compassion. Across Canada, nurses and healthcare workers faced enormous pressure. Long hours. Constant anxiety. The fear of bringing illness home to loved ones. Yet many continued showing up every day because helping others was not simply a job. It was part of who they were. Among the victims was Kristen Beaton, a continuing care assistant. Those who knew her described a woman devoted to caring for people. The profession she chose reveals something important about her character. Caring for vulnerable individuals requires patience, empathy, a willingness to place someone else's needs above your own. It is demanding work that rarely receives enough recognition. People like Kristen often become invisible heroes. The ones helping others through illness, aging, fear, and uncertainty. The pandemic had already placed extraordinary burdens on healthcare workers, yet she continued serving her community. She never expected that the danger she faced would not come from a virus but from a man driving a fake police car. Another victim was Joanne Thomas. Friends and family remembered her warmth and kindness. Like many victims in this case, she represented the interconnected nature of rural communities. Small towns function differently than large cities. People know each other's histories. They celebrate milestones together. They mourn losses together. When someone dies unexpectedly, the grief spreads outward through dozens, sometimes hundreds, of relationships. The death of one person becomes the pain of an entire community. Then there were Greg and Jamie Blair. A married couple. A partnership. Two lives moving forward together. One of the cruelest realities of mass violence is that it often destroys entire family units in a matter of seconds. A husband and wife spend years building a shared life. They create routines, inside jokes, traditions, future plans. Then a single act of violence erases both lives simultaneously. The loss extends beyond the couple themselves. Children lose parents. Siblings lose family members. Friends lose decades of memories. Entire family trees are altered forever. Greg and Jamie Blair were not merely two names on a victim list. They were a life built together. A future imagined together. A partnership that ended in violence neither could have anticipated. Another couple, Peter and Joy Bond, would also be among those killed. The names themselves sound almost poetic when spoken together. Peter and Joy. A husband and wife who had spent years creating a life side by side. The tragedy of this case lies partly in its randomness. Some victims knew the killer. Others did not. Some were targeted early. Others simply crossed paths with danger while going about their normal lives. Yet every victim shared one common trait. None of them woke up that day expecting it to be their last. Many were retired. After decades of work, retirement often represents a reward. A period when people finally have time to enjoy life on their own terms. Travel plans. Family visits. Gardening projects. Fishing trips. Morning coffee without rushing to work. Simple pleasures earned through years of effort. Several victims had reached that stage of life. They had spent decades contributing to their communities and families. The future they envisioned involved peace, not violence. Then there was Constable Heidi Stevenson. Among all the victims, her story carries a unique weight. Not because her life mattered more than the others. Every victim mattered equally. But because she consciously moved toward danger while others attempted to escape it. For more than 2 decades, Stevenson served with the RCMP. She was experienced, respected, a mother, a wife, a police officer who understood the risks associated with the profession she had chosen. Law enforcement officers accept a reality that most people never face. Every shift contains uncertainty. Every traffic stop. Every emergency call. Every encounter. Any situation can suddenly become dangerous. Yet officers continue responding because public safety depends upon it. When reports emerged of an active killer moving through Nova Scotia, Heidi Stevenson did what she had spent years training to do. She responded. She entered a situation that most people would run from. And during the effort to stop the killer, she lost her life. Her death deeply affected not only her family but also fellow officers across Canada. For many members of law enforcement, her sacrifice represented the highest cost of public service. The tragedy becomes even more haunting when we remember one crucial detail. The killer was disguised as a police officer. Stevenson died confronting a man who had twisted the very symbol she represented into a tool of deception. The contrast is impossible to ignore. One wore the uniform to serve. The other wore it to kill. The difference between those two intentions reveals everything. As investigators later documented the victims, patterns began to emerge. These were not individuals connected by one profession, one age group, or one background. They represented different generations, different careers, different lifestyles. Some were outgoing. Others were quiet. Some lived alone. Others lived with family. Some knew the killer personally. Others had never met him. What united them was not who they were. It was where they happened to be when violence arrived. That reality makes the story especially disturbing. Human beings seek reasons. We want tragedies to make sense. We prefer believing that danger follows predictable rules. That victims somehow knew they were at risk. That warning signs were obvious. But many of the people killed in Nova Scotia were engaged in ordinary activities. Driving. Relaxing at home. Checking on neighbors. Living normal lives. The randomness forces uncomfortable questions. Could it have happened to anyone? Would different choices have changed anything? Could warning systems have saved lives? Those questions would become central to the public inquiry that followed. Yet behind every policy discussion remained a much more personal truth. Families were grieving. Across Nova Scotia, phone calls began changing lives forever. Police officers arrived at homes carrying devastating news. Relatives answered calls that instantly divided their lives into before and after. Some family members learned details gradually. Others experienced a sudden flood of information from news reports, social media, and official notifications. Shock has a strange quality. People often describe feeling detached from reality, as though events are happening to someone else, as though there has been a mistake, as though the world will correct itself if they wait long enough. But reality never corrected itself. The victims were gone, and the scale of the loss continued growing. Friends remembered conversations that now felt precious. A laugh. A joke. A casual goodbye. The ordinary moments that suddenly become priceless after someone dies. People searched through photographs, voicemail messages, text messages. Anything that preserved a connection. Anything that made the loss feel slightly less final. Entire communities entered mourning. Memorials appeared. Flowers accumulated. Candles flickered. Names were spoken repeatedly. Stories were shared. Because that is what communities do after tragedy. They tell stories. They remember. They refuse to allow victims to become statistics. Perhaps that is the most important thing to understand before continuing. The Nova Scotia mass shooting is often described through numbers. 22 dead. Multiple crime scenes. 13 hours of violence. But numbers can create emotional distance. They compress human lives into data. The reality was far more personal. 22 empty chairs at future family gatherings. 22 unfinished stories. 22 lives that mattered deeply to the people who knew them. A young woman with her entire future ahead of her. Healthcare workers who dedicated themselves to helping others. Retired couples enjoying the next chapter of life. Friends and neighbors who believed they were living in safe communities. A veteran police officer who answered the call of duty. Each victim carried dreams, fears, habits, memories, and relationships that made them unique. Each victim left behind people who loved them. And as darkness settled over Nova Scotia on April 18th, none of them could have imagined that they were living the final ordinary hours of their lives. The world still felt familiar. The future still felt certain. Tomorrow still existed. But somewhere nearby, a man consumed by violence was preparing to shatter all of it. And before sunrise, 22 stories would be brought to a tragic end, leaving an entire province struggling to understand how so much loss could emerge from a single night of unimaginable horror. Part 4. The Incident. The evening of April 18, 2020, arrived quietly across Nova Scotia. Spring had finally begun to loosen winter's grip on the province. The forests surrounding Portapique stood dark beneath a cloud-covered sky, while the cool Atlantic air drifted inland through the scattered communities that dotted the coastline. Across the region, people settled into familiar routines. Some watched television. Others spoke with family members over the phone. Many remained at home due to restrictions associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to adapt to a world that already felt uncertain. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would become one of the darkest nights in Canadian history. In Portapique, a small rural community known for its peaceful atmosphere and isolated properties, most residents were preparing for an ordinary night. The roads were quiet. Houses sat separated by stretches of woodland. Neighbors often lived hundreds of feet apart, connected by long driveways and winding lanes. It was a place where privacy was abundant and where many people felt insulated from the dangers associated with larger cities. That sense of security would soon disappear. Sometime during the evening, an incident occurred involving Gabriel Wortman and his common-law partner. Investigators would later determine that the confrontation became violent. The woman managed to escape and hide, a decision that ultimately saved her life. Her survival would later provide investigators with critical insight into the events that followed. What happened next transformed a domestic violence incident into a catastrophe that would span multiple communities. Armed and increasingly dangerous, Wortman began moving through Portapique. Over the following hours, a series of attacks occurred across the area. Several homes became scenes of violence. Fires were deliberately set. Structures that had stood peacefully among the trees for years suddenly became engulfed in flames. Residents who observed smoke in the distance could not immediately understand what was happening. For some, the fires appeared isolated. For others, they seemed like unfortunate accidents. The truth was far worse. As emergency responders gradually became aware that a major incident was unfolding, confusion dominated the early stages of the response. Reports arriving through emergency channels appeared fragmented and incomplete. Information emerged from multiple locations at once. Witnesses described different events occurring across a broad area. At first, nobody understood the full scale of the crisis. The geography of Portapique made matters even more difficult. Dense woods, limited road access, and widely separated properties complicated efforts to determine exactly what was taking place. Emergency personnel arriving in the area faced an environment where visibility was limited and reliable information was scarce. As the hours passed, investigators would later conclude that the number of victims continued to grow. Some of the people targeted were known to Wortman. Others appear to have encountered him during the course of his movements through the community. The violence was not confined to a single location. Instead, it spread across multiple sites, creating a rapidly expanding emergency unlike anything local authorities had previously experienced. Meanwhile, one element of the unfolding crisis would eventually become one of the most shocking aspects of the entire case. Wortman had equipped himself with items that closely resembled those used by members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He wore clothing that appeared to be an RCMP uniform. He drove a vehicle designed to closely imitate an RCMP patrol car. The significance of this deception cannot be overstated. In communities throughout Canada, police vehicles are symbols of safety and authority. Citizens are conditioned to trust them. They represent assistance during emergencies and reassurance during moments of uncertainty. By adopting that appearance, Wortman created a situation that investigators and public officials would later describe as extraordinarily dangerous. People encountering what appeared to be a police vehicle could have had no immediate reason to suspect that the individual inside was not a genuine officer. This deception would become one of the defining features of the case and one of the factors that generated intense public discussion in the years that followed. Throughout the night, emergency responders worked to understand what was occurring. Officers secured areas where incidents had been reported while attempting to gather information about the suspect's whereabouts. Yet the situation remained fluid. Unlike many major criminal incidents that occur within a fixed location, this event continued to evolve over time. The suspect remained mobile. The crime scenes multiplied. The uncertainty deepened. By the early hours of April 19th, authorities had begun recognizing that they were dealing with an unprecedented event. The investigation was no longer focused on a single location in Porter-Peak. The threat had expanded beyond the community. As daylight approached, the situation entered a new phase. Roads that were normally quiet on a Sunday morning became part of an active police response stretching across multiple jurisdictions. Officers worked to track a suspect whose movements were difficult to predict and whose appearance complicated efforts to identify him quickly. Across Nova Scotia, many residents remained unaware of the full danger. Some were sleeping. Others were beginning their morning routines. The province had not yet absorbed the reality of what had happened overnight. For families connected to the victims, however, everything had already changed. Loved ones who expected to hear from relatives later that day would soon find themselves confronting unimaginable news. Communities that had always viewed themselves as safe would begin to understand that they had become the center of a national tragedy. As mourning continued, authorities expanded their efforts to locate Wortman. Reports and sightings emerged from different locations. Investigators worked to distinguish reliable information from rumor while attempting to stay ahead of a rapidly changing situation. The challenge was immense. Every minute mattered. Every report required evaluation. Every decision carried consequences. The uncertainty affected both the public and law enforcement personnel. No one knew exactly where the suspect would appear next. No one knew how long the crisis would continue. No one knew how many lives had already been affected. What had begun in Porter-Peak was no longer a local emergency. It had become a province-wide manhunt. The events unfolding that morning would ultimately lead to additional tragedy, additional victims, and growing questions about communication, public warnings, and emergency response. Yet even as those questions emerged, the immediate priority remained unchanged. Find the suspect. Protect the public. End the threat. Hours after the violence had first begun, law enforcement officers continued working to piece together an event that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The scale of the destruction became clearer with each passing hour. Additional crime scenes were identified. Additional victims were discovered. The human cost of the tragedy continued to grow. By the time the incident finally came to an end later on April 19, 22 people would be dead. Countless others would be traumatized. Entire communities would be forever altered. And Canada would find itself confronting difficult questions about violence, warning signs, public safety, domestic abuse, and institutional preparedness. The incident itself lasted little more than half a day. Its consequences would last far longer. For survivors, memories of those hours would remain vivid for years. For investigators, the task of reconstructing exactly what happened would become one of the most extensive inquiries in Canadian history. For families, the timeline of the attack would matter less than a painful reality that could not be changed. The people they loved were gone. And for Nova Scotia, April 18th and April 19th, 2020, would become dates forever associated with loss, grief, and a tragedy that reshaped an entire province. The violence eventually ended. The questions did not. Those questions would soon lead investigators toward dozens of crime scenes, hundreds of witnesses, and one of the most complex criminal investigations Canada had ever undertaken. By the morning of April 19, 2020, Nova Scotia was waking up to confusion. At first, many residents knew only fragments of what had happened overnight. A rumor about a shooting. A report of a fire. A police operation somewhere near Porter-Peak. For people outside the immediate area, the information seemed incomplete and distant. Like many breaking news events, the earliest reports lacked clarity. Nobody yet understood the true scale of the tragedy. But for investigators arriving at the first scenes, the reality was beginning to emerge. And it was far worse than anyone had imagined. As officers moved through Porter-Peak during the early hours of the morning, They encountered a landscape that appeared almost surreal. Smoke lingered above portions of the community. Several structures had been damaged or destroyed by fire. Emergency vehicles moved cautiously through roads that only hours earlier had been completely quiet. The first priority was safety. Authorities still believed the suspect was alive and mobile. That single fact influenced every decision investigators made. Crime scene work that might normally begin immediately had to wait in some locations because officers could not be certain the danger had ended. Every wooded area, every abandoned structure, every stretch of road had to be treated carefully. The suspect could still be nearby. As the search continued, investigators slowly began documenting what they were finding. One location became several. Several became many. The growing number of scenes created an enormous challenge. Unlike a traditional homicide investigation centered around a single residence or one isolated area, this case stretched across multiple communities and numerous properties. Each location represented its own collection of evidence. Each location had its own witnesses, its own timeline, its own questions. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with one of the most complex crime scenes in Canadian history. The word scene hardly seemed adequate. This was not a single scene. It was an entire network of scenes spread across dozens of miles. One detective later described similar investigations as trying to assemble a 1,000-piece puzzle while new pieces continue appearing every hour. That description fit Nova Scotia perfectly. At some locations, evidence had been affected by fire. At others, weather conditions created additional challenges. Vehicles required examination. Buildings required examination. Roadways required examination. The sheer volume of work was staggering. Meanwhile, forensic teams began the difficult task of identifying victims and establishing accurate timelines. This process is often invisible to the public. When people watch true crime documentaries, they frequently see dramatic breakthroughs and courtroom testimony. What they rarely see are the hundreds of hours spent documenting evidence, photographing scenes, collecting samples, comparing records, interviewing witnesses, reviewing timelines minute by minute. Major investigations are often built upon patience rather than dramatic moments. And patience would be essential here. The destruction left behind by the fires complicated matters significantly. Fire scenes present unique forensic challenges. Heat can damage evidence. Smoke can obscure details. Structural collapse can alter the original environment. Investigators therefore faced two overlapping questions. How had the fires started? And what evidence had survived them? Specialists from multiple disciplines became involved. Fire investigators worked alongside homicide investigators. Forensic analysts coordinated with local officers. Federal resources joined provincial efforts. The scale of the investigation demanded cooperation across numerous agencies. Yet while investigators worked methodically, public concern continued growing. News coverage expanded rapidly. Residents throughout Nova Scotia wanted answers. What exactly had happened? How many people had been killed? Was the danger over? How had one person managed to create so much devastation? Many of those questions could not yet be answered. Investigators themselves were still learning basic facts. The situation remained fluid. Victim identification required time. Witness interviews required time. Evidence analysis required time. And while the public understandably wanted immediate explanations, detectives understood that rushing conclusions could create lasting problems. The facts had to be established carefully. One of the earliest and most shocking discoveries involved the extent of the suspect's deception. As investigators examined evidence connected to Gabriel Wortman, they documented the remarkable effort he had invested in creating the appearance of a police officer. The replica police vehicle immediately attracted national attention. Photographs of the vehicle would later circulate widely. To many observers, the resemblance to a genuine RCMP cruiser was deeply unsettling. This was not a casual imitation. It was a carefully constructed disguise. The implications were enormous. Trust plays a central role in public safety. Citizens are taught to recognize police vehicles as symbols of protection. The discovery that a mass killer had intentionally exploited that trust transformed the case from a horrific shooting into something even more psychologically disturbing. Investigators now had to consider not only what the suspect had done but how he had done it. The disguise became a critical component of understanding the tragedy. As witness interviews expanded, detectives encountered another challenge common in large-scale investigations. Memory. Human memory is imperfect, especially during traumatic events. Witnesses often remember certain details vividly while forgetting others entirely. Some recall exact conversations but struggle to estimate time. Others remember vehicles, clothing, or locations while losing track of sequence. This does not mean witnesses are unreliable. It means trauma affects perception. Investigators therefore compared statements carefully. One account supported another. A timeline emerged. Then another witness filled in missing pieces. Gradually, the picture became clearer. The process resembled archaeology more than detective fiction. Layers of information were uncovered one at a time. Some witnesses described seeing smoke. Others recalled unusual vehicle movements. Some reported interactions that only later seemed significant. Many had no idea they possessed important information until investigators contacted them. Every detail mattered. Every observation potentially helped establish the movement of the suspect across the province. The complexity of the investigation increased further because some victims and witnesses knew Wortman personally while others did not. This distinction became important. Investigators needed to determine whether specific individuals had been targeted or whether they had simply crossed paths with the suspect during his movements. Understanding motive is often one of the most difficult aspects of homicide investigations. Physical evidence can establish what happened. Motive often requires understanding why. And human behavior rarely fits neatly into simple explanations. As detectives explored Wortman's background, they began examining years of personal history, relationships, business dealings, prior incidents, patterns of behavior. Investigators searched for clues that might explain how an apparently successful businessman became responsible for such catastrophic violence. What they found suggested a far more complicated story than many initially assumed. Yet even as investigators looked backward, they also faced growing scrutiny regarding the events of the attack itself. Particular attention focused on communication. When had authorities first learned about the suspect's disguise? How was information shared with the public? Could additional warnings have saved lives? These questions emerged almost immediately. In major disasters, investigations often operate on two tracks simultaneously. One track examines the actions of the perpetrator. The other examines the response of institutions. Nova Scotia would eventually experience both. At the center of many discussions stood the issue of emergency alerts. Canada possesses systems capable of sending urgent warnings directly to mobile devices. Many residents later questioned why broader alerts were not issued sooner. Others pointed to the reliance on social media updates during portions of the crisis. These concerns would eventually become central topics during public inquiries. But during the immediate aftermath, investigators remained focused on establishing facts. Speculation could wait. Evidence could not. As additional scenes were processed, the scale of the tragedy became undeniable. 22 victims. Multiple communities. Numerous fires. Countless witnesses. The numbers alone were staggering. Yet investigators understood that each statistic represented a human life. A family. A future interrupted. Forensic work therefore carried a deeper purpose. This was not merely about solving a crime. The suspect was already dead. The investigation existed to establish truth, to provide answers, to document events accurately, and to ensure that victims and families received a complete account of what had happened. That mission became increasingly important as national attention intensified. Journalists arrived. Political leaders issued statements. Questions multiplied. The entire country wanted explanations. Yet the individuals closest to the tragedy often wanted something simpler. They wanted certainty. Families wanted to know where their loved ones had been, what their final hours looked like, whether they suffered, whether anything could have been done differently. These are among the hardest questions investigators ever face. Sometimes answers exist. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes evidence fills the gaps. Sometimes uncertainty remains forever. By the end of the first days following the attack, one reality had become unmistakable. The Nova Scotia mass shooting was not simply another criminal investigation. It was a historic event. The deadliest mass shooting in modern Canadian history. An event whose consequences would shape public policy, police procedures, and national conversations for years to come. Yet history is ultimately built from individual moments. A witness remembering a vehicle. An investigator documenting evidence. A family waiting for answers. A community struggling to understand loss. Those moments formed the foundation of everything that followed. And as investigators continued assembling the enormous puzzle before them, they knew the work was far from over. The suspect's path had been identified. The scale of the tragedy had become clear. But the deeper questions remained unanswered. Why had this happened? Could warning signs have been recognized sooner? Were there missed opportunities to intervene before violence erupted? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons could be learned to prevent another tragedy like this from ever occurring again? The search for those answers would soon move beyond crime scenes and forensic reports. It would lead investigators into the suspect's past, into institutional decisions, and into one of the most extensive public examinations of a mass casualty event ever conducted in Canada. The discovery phase had revealed the scope of the catastrophe. The next phase would attempt to explain it. In many homicide cases, investigators begin with a simple question. Who did it? In Nova Scotia, that question had already been answered. Gabriel Wortman was dead. His identity was known. His route had been largely reconstructed. His responsibility for the killings was not in doubt. Yet paradoxically, the investigation that followed became one of the most extensive and complicated in Canadian history. Because once detectives knew who had committed the crimes, a different set of questions emerged. Why did it happen? How did it happen? Could it have been prevented? And perhaps most controversially, were there opportunities to reduce the number of victims once the attack had already begun? Those questions would drive investigators for months and eventually shape a public inquiry that examined not only the actions of one man but also the systems surrounding him. In the days immediately following the tragedy, law enforcement agencies faced an enormous challenge. The crime scenes stretched across multiple communities. Witnesses numbered in the hundreds. Physical evidence filled warehouses. Digital evidence filled databases. Every movement made by Gabriel Wortman during the attack had to be reconstructed as accurately as possible. Investigators began building a timeline. A timeline that eventually grew into a minute-by-minute reconstruction of one of the darkest events in Canadian history. This process required extraordinary attention to detail. Phone records were reviewed. Surveillance footage was collected. Witness statements were compared. Vehicle sightings were analyzed. GPS data was examined. Every available source of information became part of a larger effort to understand exactly what had occurred. As detectives worked through the evidence, one realization became increasingly clear. The attack itself could not be understood without examining the years that preceded it. The story did not begin on April 18, 2020. It began long before that. Investigators therefore turned their attention toward Gabriel Wortman's background. Friends. Former associates. Neighbors. Business contacts. Family members. Anyone who had known him potentially possessed a piece of the puzzle. The picture that emerged was complicated. To some people, Wortman appeared successful. He owned a denture business. He possessed property. He enjoyed expensive vehicles. He projected confidence. Many people who met him casually described him as charming and outgoing. He could be generous. He could be engaging. He often seemed capable of making positive impressions. But investigators quickly learned that there was another side. A darker side that many individuals had experienced firsthand. As interviews accumulated, reports began revealing patterns of controlling behavior, intimidation, and aggression. Some individuals described incidents that had frightened them. Others recalled verbal threats. Several spoke of episodes involving anger that appeared disproportionate to the situation. The details varied, but the pattern itself became increasingly difficult to ignore. This phenomenon is common in major criminal investigations. When detectives examine a suspect's life after a catastrophic act, they often discover that warning signs existed. The difficulty is that those signs rarely appear connected in real time. One person witnesses one incident. Another person witnesses something else. Each event appears isolated. Only afterward do investigators assemble the complete picture. The Nova Scotia case followed a similar pattern. One of the most significant areas of focus involved allegations of domestic violence. As investigators explored Wortman's relationship history, they encountered accounts suggesting a pattern of abusive behavior. The domestic incident that preceded the massacre did not emerge from nowhere. Rather, investigators and later inquiry officials concluded that it existed within a broader context of coercion, control, and violence. This realization would eventually influence public discussions surrounding the tragedy. Many experts pointed to domestic violence as one of the strongest predictors of future serious violence. The warning signs often exist long before a catastrophic event occurs. The challenge lies in recognizing them and responding effectively. As detectives continued examining Wortman's background, another aspect of the case attracted increasing attention. His fascination with policing. Investigators discovered evidence showing that Wortman had spent considerable effort creating the appearance of a police officer. This was not an impulsive decision made during the attack. The evidence suggested preparation, planning, investment, time. The replica police vehicle became one of the most discussed elements of the entire investigation. Experts examined photographs and physical evidence. Witnesses described their reactions upon seeing it. Many expressed the same observation. At first glance, it looked authentic. That realization raised deeply troubling questions. How had the vehicle remained largely unnoticed for so long? How had someone acquired the materials necessary to create such a convincing imitation? And what did this reveal about the suspect's mindset? Investigators believed the disguise served a practical purpose during the attack. But it also appeared to reveal something psychological. The uniform represented authority, control, power. The ability to command attention and compliance. Understanding that motivation became part of understanding the offender himself. Yet while detectives examined Wortman's past, they simultaneously confronted another challenge. Public scrutiny. The tragedy had generated national attention. Media organizations pursued answers aggressively. Families demanded information. Political leaders called for accountability. Every aspect of the response came under examination. Among the most controversial issues was communication. Specifically, how information had been shared with the public during the attack. Investigators reviewing the timeline discovered that authorities became aware relatively early that the suspect was driving a replica police vehicle. The significance of this information seems obvious in hindsight. If citizens knew a fake police car was involved, they might be more cautious. They might avoid approaching certain vehicles. They might take additional protective measures. But the process of communicating that information proved far more complicated. Questions soon emerged regarding emergency alerts. Why had a province-wide alert not been issued sooner? Why were social media platforms used as a primary communication tool during portions of the crisis? How many residents actually saw those messages? Could earlier warnings have altered the outcome? These questions would become central themes in the years that followed. For investigators, however, determining answers required evidence rather than assumptions. Timelines had to be verified. Decisions had to be documented. Communications had to be reviewed. The challenge was immense because major emergencies often unfold in conditions of uncertainty. People make decisions based on incomplete information. What appears obvious afterward may not have appeared obvious in the moment. Nevertheless, investigators recognized the importance of examining these decisions honestly. Public trust depended upon transparency. Meanwhile, another major component of the investigation focused on firearms. Detectives sought to determine how Wortman had obtained the weapons used during the attacks. Tracing firearms is often a lengthy process involving records, international cooperation, and forensic analysis. Investigators examined acquisition histories, ownership records, and other evidence related to the weapons. These efforts contributed to broader discussions about firearms regulation and enforcement within Canada. The investigation also highlighted the growing importance of digital evidence in modern criminal cases. Phone records provided critical insights. Electronic communications revealed timelines. Digital footprints helped establish movements and relationships. Unlike earlier generations of investigators who relied primarily on physical evidence and witness testimony, modern detectives often reconstruct events through vast quantities of electronic data. In Nova Scotia, digital evidence became an essential tool. Yet even with technology, some questions remained frustratingly difficult. Perhaps the most difficult question involved motive. People naturally seek a clear explanation for horrific acts. A financial motive. A personal grievance. A political ideology. Something concrete. Something understandable. But human behavior rarely offers such neat answers. Investigators found evidence of anger, control, resentment, violence, domestic abuse, preparation. Yet no single explanation seemed capable of fully accounting for the scale of the attack. The reality appeared more complex. A combination of personal factors, behavioral patterns, and circumstances converging into catastrophe. This ambiguity frustrated many observers. Society often wants villains to fit recognizable categories. We prefer simple narratives. The Nova Scotia case resisted simplicity. As months passed, the investigation gradually expanded beyond traditional law enforcement efforts. Public officials announced the creation of a comprehensive inquiry. Its purpose extended beyond determining criminal responsibility. That question had already been answered. Instead, the inquiry sought to understand systemic issues. What lessons could be learned? What failures had occurred? What improvements were necessary? The scope of the examination became enormous. Witnesses testified. Experts provided analysis. Thousands of documents were reviewed. Families participated in hearings. Police actions underwent unprecedented scrutiny. For many Canadians, the inquiry became almost as significant as the criminal investigation itself. It represented an attempt to transform tragedy into understanding. Whether complete understanding is ever possible remains another question. Throughout the process, investigators repeatedly encountered a difficult truth. Major disasters rarely result from a single failure. More often, they emerge from multiple failures occurring simultaneously. Missed warning signs. Inadequate communication. Behavioral patterns overlooked. Institutional limitations. Human error. Bad luck. Each factor alone may seem manageable. Together, they become catastrophic. The Nova Scotia investigation revealed precisely that kind of complexity. There was no single moment that explained everything. No single decision that created the tragedy. Instead, investigators uncovered a web of circumstances stretching backward through years of behavior and forward through hours of crisis. By the time the investigative phase neared completion, thousands of pages of documentation had been produced. Timelines had been refined. Evidence had been analyzed. Witnesses had been heard. Yet despite all that work, one reality remained unchanged. 22 people were dead. No report could reverse that. No inquiry could undo it. No investigation could restore what had been lost. What investigators could do was establish the truth as accurately as possible. They could document what happened. They could identify failures. They could recommend reforms. They could provide families with answers wherever answers existed. And they could ensure that future generations understood not only how the tragedy unfolded but also the warning signs that preceded it. Because by the end of the investigation, one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. The Nova Scotia mass shooting was not merely a story about a killer. It was also a story about systems. About warning signs. About domestic violence. About communication during emergencies. About trust. About accountability. And as the findings accumulated, attention gradually shifted toward the next chapter. The search for justice. Not justice in the traditional sense. The perpetrator was already dead. There would be no murder trial. No guilty verdict. No sentencing hearing. Yet families still sought accountability. Communities still sought answers. And Canada still needed to decide what justice looked like when the person responsible could no longer stand before a judge. That question would define the next stage of the story. In many criminal investigations, the breakthrough arrives as a single moment. A fingerprint matches. A witness comes forward. A surveillance camera captures the crucial image. A confession changes everything. The Nova Scotia mass shooting investigation was different. There was no dramatic interrogation room revelation. No surprise arrest. No hidden suspect waiting to be identified. Gabriel Wortman was already dead. His identity had never been the mystery. The real mystery was understanding how such a catastrophe had been allowed to unfold. The breakthrough, therefore, did not come from discovering who committed the crimes. It came from uncovering the deeper story behind them. As investigators, journalists, independent experts, and eventually inquiry commissioners examined thousands of documents, a larger picture slowly emerged. At first, the evidence appeared fragmented. Witness statements. Police logs. Emergency communications. Phone records. Personal histories. Reports from friends and family. Each piece seemed important, but none provided a complete explanation on its own. Only when those pieces were assembled together did investigators begin seeing patterns that had remained invisible before. One of the first major realizations involved the role of domestic violence. For years, public discussion had largely focused on the shootings themselves. The replica police vehicle. The manhunt. The failures in communication. The unprecedented death toll. But as evidence accumulated, investigators increasingly concluded that the massacre could not be separated from the history of abuse that preceded it. The violence did not suddenly appear on April 18, 2020. Rather, it existed on a continuum. The attack represented the most extreme expression of behaviors that had allegedly existed for years. This realization became one of the inquiry's most significant findings. Experts in domestic violence repeatedly explained that many perpetrators display recognizable patterns long before catastrophic events occur. Control. Manipulation. Threats. Intimidation. Isolation. Physical aggression. Each behavior serves as a warning sign. Each represents a potential indicator of escalating danger. Viewed individually, these incidents sometimes appear manageable. Viewed collectively, they reveal a far more troubling picture. For investigators, this represented a critical breakthrough. The massacre was no longer understood solely as a mass shooting. It was also understood as an extension of domestic violence. That distinction mattered. Because it changed how experts interpreted the warning signs. It changed how policymakers discussed prevention. And it changed how many Canadians understood the tragedy itself. As investigators continued digging deeper, another breakthrough emerged. This one involved communication. From the earliest days following the attack, questions had surrounded the public warning process. Families wanted to know why more people had not been alerted sooner. Residents wanted to understand how information had been shared during the crisis. Officials wanted to determine whether existing emergency systems had been used effectively. The inquiry spent considerable time examining these issues. Thousands of pages of records were reviewed. Emergency communications were analyzed. Witnesses testified about decisions made under pressure. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged. Investigators found that information regarding the suspect and his replica police vehicle became known to authorities relatively early in the response. Yet broad public notification did not occur immediately through the province's emergency alert system. Instead, some warnings were distributed through social media. This finding became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. The issue was not merely technological. It was philosophical. Who bears responsibility for informing the public during a rapidly evolving crisis? How quickly should warnings be issued? What level of certainty is required before emergency alerts are activated? What happens when information is incomplete? These questions had existed before the Nova Scotia tragedy. Afterward, they became impossible to ignore. For families of victims, the issue felt deeply personal. Every missed minute mattered. Every delay carried emotional weight. Many wondered whether earlier warnings could have changed outcomes. Could someone have stayed home? Could someone have avoided a particular road? Could lives have been saved? Investigators approached these questions carefully. Absolute certainty is rarely possible in retrospective analysis. Yet the inquiry ultimately identified significant shortcomings in communication and emergency response. Those findings would eventually influence recommendations for future reforms. Meanwhile, another important breakthrough involved understanding the extent of Wortmann's preparation. As evidence was reviewed, investigators concluded that many aspects of the attack required planning. The replica police vehicle had not appeared overnight. The police-style equipment had not materialized by accident. These elements suggested forethought, preparation, intentional effort. That realization complicated earlier assumptions that the violence was purely impulsive. Certainly, rage and emotional instability appeared to play important roles. But investigators increasingly recognized evidence of planning as well. Human behavior is rarely driven by a single factor. The attack appeared to reflect both immediate triggers and longer-term preparations. This understanding helped investigators construct a more complete psychological profile. The portrait that emerged was deeply troubling. Witnesses described an individual capable of charm and generosity in some situations. Yet they also described intimidation, volatility, and controlling behavior in others. The contrast itself became important. Many dangerous individuals are not dangerous all the time. They can appear friendly, helpful, successful, normal. That duality often makes warning signs more difficult to recognize. The public tends to imagine violent offenders as obviously threatening. Reality is often far more complicated. Some people experience only the charming version. Others experience the frightening version. Only after a tragedy do those experiences converge into a complete picture. Perhaps the most significant breakthrough of all came through the inquiry process itself. Unlike traditional criminal investigations, public inquiries serve a broader purpose. They do not merely establish facts. They attempt to understand systems, institutions, decisions, failures, successes. And the inquiry into the Nova Scotia mass shooting became one of the most comprehensive examinations of a mass casualty event ever conducted in Canada. Witnesses testified publicly. Families shared their experiences. Experts analyzed evidence. Police leaders answered difficult questions. Government officials provided explanations. The process lasted years. At times, it was painful. At times, controversial. At times, emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Yet it also created something valuable. Transparency. For many families, understanding what happened mattered almost as much as understanding why. They wanted the truth. Even when the truth was uncomfortable. Even when the truth revealed mistakes. The inquiry therefore became a search for accountability in the absence of a criminal trial. Normally, a courtroom serves as the place where evidence is examined publicly. Witnesses testify. Facts are challenged. Responsibility is assigned. In Nova Scotia, that path was unavailable. The perpetrator could never stand before a judge. The inquiry became the closest alternative. And as findings accumulated, a broader narrative emerged. The tragedy had not resulted from a single failure. It had resulted from multiple failures intersecting with one extraordinarily dangerous individual. Warning signs regarding violence. Challenges involving firearms. Communication issues. Emergency response difficulties. Institutional limitations. Human decisions made under pressure. All of these factors contributed to the larger story. The breakthrough was therefore not one revelation. It was the realization that no simple explanation existed. The tragedy was more complex than many people initially believed. More complicated. More uncomfortable. And perhaps more instructive. Because simple stories rarely produce meaningful lessons. Complex stories do. By the time inquiry findings began reaching the public, Canada had entered a period of reflection. News coverage increasingly focused on prevention. Experts discussed domestic violence intervention, emergency management reforms, public alert systems, information sharing, firearms enforcement, police accountability. The conversation had expanded beyond the individual offender. It now centered on what society could learn. This shift represented another important breakthrough. The focus gradually moved away from the killer and toward the victims, the survivors, and the future. What changes could reduce risk? What systems required improvement? What warning signs deserved greater attention? These questions would ultimately shape the inquiry's recommendations. Hundreds of recommendations and observations emerged from years of analysis. Some addressed policing. Others focused on public safety. Many highlighted domestic violence. Together, they represented an effort to transform tragedy into prevention. Whether every recommendation would be implemented remained uncertain. But the process itself reflected a collective determination to learn from what happened. For families, however, breakthroughs often felt different. Investigators measured success through findings, reports, evidence, conclusions. Families measured success through answers, through understanding, through knowing that the people they loved would not simply become statistics in a history book. In many ways, the inquiry provided that understanding. It documented who the victims were. It recorded what occurred. It acknowledged failures. It recognized courage. It preserved memory. And perhaps most importantly, it established a detailed public record that could not be ignored. By the end of this phase, the central mysteries had largely been resolved. The attack had been reconstructed. The perpetrator's background had been examined. Institutional shortcomings had been identified. Recommendations had been issued. The breakthrough had arrived. Not as a dramatic revelation. Not as a surprise confession. But as something more meaningful. A clearer understanding of the truth. Yet one final question remained. What does justice look like when the person responsible is already dead? How does a society pursue accountability when no criminal trial will ever occur? How do families find closure without a verdict? Those questions would shape the next and perhaps most emotionally complex chapter of the story. The search for justice. In most true crime stories, the pursuit of justice follows a familiar path. The suspect is arrested. Charges are filed. Evidence is presented before a court. Witnesses testify. A jury reaches a verdict. Then, finally, a sentence is handed down. The process is rarely perfect, but it provides something essential. A public reckoning. A formal acknowledgement of responsibility. A moment when victims and families can look directly at the person who caused their suffering and hear society declare that what happened was wrong. The Nova Scotia mass shooting offered none of those things. There would be no arrest. No trial. No guilty verdict. No sentencing hearing. Gabriel Wortman died on April 19, 2020, when RCMP officers confronted him at a gas station in Enfield. The moment he died, the possibility of a criminal prosecution died with him. For many families, that reality created a unique and painful challenge. The person responsible would never sit in a courtroom. He would never answer questions. He would never explain his actions. He would never hear the names of the people whose lives he destroyed. And he would never receive a sentence proportionate to the suffering he caused. Instead, families were left with grief, unanswered questions, and the difficult realization that traditional justice would never arrive. In the weeks following the tragedy, Nova Scotia entered a period of collective mourning. Memorials appeared across the province. Flowers accumulated near crime scenes. Messages of support arrived from across Canada and around the world. Politicians delivered speeches. Community leaders organized vigils. Churches held services. Flags were lowered. The country mourned alongside the families. Yet beneath the public expressions of sympathy, frustration continued growing. The more people learned about the attack, the more questions emerged. Why had warning signs been missed? Why had domestic violence concerns not triggered greater intervention? Why had the suspect been able to acquire and maintain a replica police vehicle? Why had emergency communications unfolded the way they did? Could more lives have been saved? These questions could not be answered through a criminal trial. They required something else. Public accountability. As pressure mounted, governments faced increasing demands for transparency. Families wanted more than condolences. They wanted facts. They wanted explanations. They wanted assurances that lessons would be learned. Eventually, those demands led to one of the largest public examinations of a mass casualty event in Canadian history. The Mass Casualty Commission was established to investigate not only what happened but why it happened. Its mission extended far beyond criminal responsibility. Everyone already knew who committed the murders. The real challenge involved understanding the circumstances that allowed the tragedy to unfold. For many families, the commission became the closest thing they would ever receive to a courtroom. It offered a public forum, a place where evidence could be examined, a place where officials could be questioned, a place where difficult conversations could occur in full view of the nation. The process would take years. Thousands of documents were gathered. Hundreds of witnesses participated. Investigators reviewed police communications, emergency response records, forensic evidence, expert testimony, and personal histories. The amount of information examined was staggering. Yet every document served the same purpose: to move closer to the truth. As hearings progressed, families listened to details that were often painful. They heard timelines reconstructed minute by minute. They learned how decisions had been made during the crisis. They listened to discussions about communication failures, command structures, emergency alerts, and investigative findings. For some relatives, the experience was emotionally exhausting. Every new revelation reopened wounds. Every discussion of the attack brought back memories of loss. Yet many believed the process was necessary. Because unanswered questions can become their own form of suffering. One of the central themes that emerged involved domestic violence. Experts testified that the massacre could not be understood in isolation. They argued that the attack represented the culmination of a long pattern of abusive behavior. This conclusion became one of the most significant findings of the entire inquiry. For decades, society often treated domestic violence as a private matter. Something confined within relationships. Something separate from broader public safety concerns. The Nova Scotia tragedy challenged that assumption. The inquiry repeatedly emphasized that domestic violence can be a community safety issue. It can escalate. It can expand. And in rare but devastating cases, it can evolve into mass violence. This finding transformed the conversation surrounding the attack. The story was no longer only about firearms or policing. It was also about recognizing patterns of abuse before they become catastrophic. Another major issue involved emergency communication. During the attack, police used social media to distribute some information about the suspect. Critics argued that broader emergency alerts should have been issued sooner. Families wanted to know whether faster warnings could have saved lives. The inquiry explored these questions extensively. Witnesses explained decision-making processes. Experts evaluated emergency notification systems. Officials defended some actions while acknowledging shortcomings in others. The discussions were often uncomfortable. Yet accountability is rarely comfortable. True accountability requires examining mistakes honestly. It requires resisting the temptation to protect reputations. It requires asking difficult questions even when answers may reveal institutional failures. The Commission's findings eventually concluded that significant communication shortcomings had occurred. Recommendations were made to improve emergency alert systems, information sharing, and public warning procedures. For families, however, recommendations alone could never fully satisfy the need for justice. Recommendations can prevent future tragedies. They cannot reverse past ones. This distinction remained at the heart of the entire process. Every report, every hearing, every policy proposal existed alongside an unavoidable reality. 22 people were still gone. Nothing could change that. Among those 22 victims was RCMP Constable Heidi Stevenson. Her death carried particular symbolic weight. She represented the very institution the killer had chosen to imitate. During the inquiry, discussions about her actions highlighted courage under extraordinary circumstances. She responded to protect the public. She confronted danger directly. And she paid the ultimate price. Her story became one example of how heroism and tragedy often exist side by side. Yet the inquiry consistently emphasized that every victim mattered equally. Teachers, healthcare workers, retirees, neighbors, friends, family members. Each life represented a unique loss. Each deserved recognition. As the Commission moved toward its final conclusions, a broader vision of justice began to emerge. It was not the justice of a criminal courtroom. It was the justice of truth. The justice of transparency. The justice of learning. The justice of acknowledging mistakes. The justice of preserving memory. This form of justice can feel unsatisfying compared to a conviction. It lacks the emotional finality of a verdict. There is no dramatic moment when a judge announces a sentence. No opportunity for victims' families to see the offender held accountable face to face. Yet in cases where a perpetrator is already dead, truth may be the closest form of justice available. The final report ultimately contained hundreds of findings, observations, and recommendations. Some focused on policing. Others addressed domestic violence prevention. Many dealt with public safety systems and emergency management. Together, they represented an effort to ensure that the tragedy would leave behind more than grief. It would leave behind lessons. Whether those lessons would be fully implemented remained an open question. History shows that reform often moves slowly. Institutions sometimes resist change. Public attention eventually shifts elsewhere. Yet the families of the victims remained determined that the lessons should not be forgotten. Their advocacy became an important part of the story. They pushed for accountability. They demanded transparency. They insisted that the names of their loved ones remain central to the narrative. In doing so, they helped redefine what justice could mean after a mass casualty event. Justice was not a prison sentence. Justice was ensuring that the victims were remembered. Justice was forcing institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Justice was creating reforms that might save lives in the future. Justice was refusing to allow the tragedy to become just another headline. By the time the inquiry concluded, Canada possessed a far clearer understanding of what had happened in Nova Scotia. The facts had been documented. The failures had been examined. The recommendations had been issued. The historical record had been established. Yet even after years of investigation and public scrutiny, one reality remained unchanged. No report could heal every wound. No recommendation could erase every memory. No finding could restore the futures that had been stolen. The search for justice had produced answers. But answers are not the same as closure. Closure, if it exists at all, arrives much more slowly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes decades. Sometimes it never arrives completely. And so, as the legal and investigative chapters of the story drew toward their conclusion, attention gradually shifted toward something deeper. Not punishment. Not accountability. But remembrance. The question was no longer how the tragedy happened. The question became how Nova Scotia, and Canada as a whole, would live with its legacy. That final chapter belongs not to the killer, not to investigators, and not to institutions. It belongs to the survivors, the families, and the communities forever changed by 2 days in April 2020. It is there, in memory and reflection, that the story reaches its true ending. Long after the police vehicles disappeared. Long after the news helicopters left. Long after investigators packed away evidence and closed the final crime scenes. Nova Scotia remained changed. That is one of the least understood truths about mass violence. The event itself may last hours. The aftermath lasts years. Sometimes generations. When people think about tragedies, they often focus on the moment of impact. The gunshots. The headlines. The breaking news alerts. The dramatic developments that dominate television screens. But for survivors, families, and communities, the hardest chapter often begins after the cameras leave. Because that is when reality settles in. That is when grief becomes permanent. That is when empty chairs begin appearing at family gatherings. That is when birthdays arrive without the people who should be celebrating them. That is when ordinary moments become painful reminders of what has been lost. For Nova Scotia, the aftermath began almost immediately. Communities that had once been known primarily for their quiet beauty suddenly became associated with tragedy. The name Portapique entered the national consciousness. Not because of its coastline. Not because of its history. But because it became the starting point of the deadliest mass shooting in modern Canadian history. Residents faced an unusual burden. They were not only grieving. They were grieving under public attention. Journalists arrived. Documentary crews arrived. Researchers arrived. Politicians arrived. Questions came from every direction. People wanted explanations. People wanted details. People wanted answers. Yet for many local residents, life was already difficult enough. Some had lost family members. Others had lost close friends. Some had witnessed events they would never forget. Many struggled with emotions that seemed impossible to organize. Shock. Anger. Fear. Sadness. Confusion. All existing simultaneously. Trauma has a way of disrupting the normal flow of life. Simple activities become difficult. Concentration disappears. Sleep becomes unreliable. Memories emerge unexpectedly. A familiar road. A passing vehicle. A news report. Anything can trigger recollections. For some survivors, recovery is not a straight line. There are good days and bad days. Moments of progress followed by moments of setback. Months later, people may appear fine on the outside while privately continuing battles nobody else can see. Mental health professionals who worked with affected communities understood this reality well. The wounds created by violence are not always visible. Many of the deepest injuries cannot be photographed. They exist within memory, within emotion, within the quiet moments when individuals are left alone with their thoughts. Children who lost parents faced futures they never expected. Spouses suddenly found themselves alone. Brothers and sisters carried grief that would accompany them for the rest of their lives. Friends struggled to understand why one person survived while another did not. This phenomenon, often called survivor's guilt, appears repeatedly after major tragedies. People ask themselves impossible questions. What if I had called sooner? What if I had visited that day? What if I had convinced them to stay home? What if? The problem with such questions is that they never end. There is always another possibility. Another scenario. Another imagined outcome. Yet the past remains unchanged. One of the cruelest aspects of tragedy is that it leaves people searching for control in situations where they never truly possessed it. As years passed, memorials became important places of reflection. Flowers eventually faded. Candles eventually burned out. But remembrance remained. Communities found ways to honor the victims. Names continued to be spoken. Stories continued to be shared. Photographs continued to be displayed. Because memory serves a purpose. It resists the tendency of history to reduce people to statistics. 22 victims. Those two words appear in nearly every summary of the case. 22 victims. A simple number. Yet numbers conceal as much as they reveal. 22 people means 22 lives. 22 histories. 22 personalities. 22 collections of dreams, habits, friendships, fears, and aspirations. A teenager who should have had decades ahead of her. Healthcare workers who dedicated themselves to helping others. Retired couples enjoying a chapter of life they had earned through years of effort. A veteran police officer committed to protecting her community. Each victim represented an entire universe of relationships. And every one of those universes experienced permanent disruption. The tragedy also forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths. One of those truths involved domestic violence. For many years, public discussions about violence often separated domestic abuse from broader public safety concerns. The Nova Scotia massacre challenged that distinction. The inquiry repeatedly emphasized the connections between domestic violence and escalating forms of harm. Experts argued that warning signs deserve greater attention. Not because every abusive individual becomes a mass murderer. Most do not. But because patterns of coercion, control, intimidation, and violence should never be dismissed as private matters without broader significance. Another lesson involved communication. In the modern world, information can save lives. But information only helps when people receive it. The debate surrounding emergency alerts became one of the most significant legacies of the case. Canadians began asking difficult questions. How should authorities communicate during fast-moving emergencies? How quickly should alerts be issued? What systems work best? What happens when information is incomplete? The answers continue evolving. Yet the discussion itself represented progress. Tragedies often expose weaknesses that remain invisible during normal times. The challenge is whether societies learn from those weaknesses or simply move on. The Nova Scotia mass shooting also revealed something profound about trust. Trust is one of the foundations upon which communities are built. People trust neighbors. They trust institutions. They trust emergency responders. They trust symbols of authority. Gabriel Wortman exploited that trust through his disguise. His imitation police vehicle and uniform transformed a symbol of protection into a tool of deception. The psychological impact of that fact extended far beyond the attack itself. Many Canadians found it deeply unsettling. Not simply because it was effective, but because it violated a fundamental expectation. The expectation that certain symbols represent safety. Recovering from that violation requires more than policy changes. It requires rebuilding confidence. Rebuilding trust. And trust, once damaged, often heals slowly. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the aftermath was the resilience displayed by affected communities. Resilience is a word frequently used after disasters. Sometimes too frequently. It can sound simplistic. As though recovery is easy. As though strength appears automatically. In reality, resilience is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to continue despite pain. To keep moving forward while carrying loss. To build a future without forgetting the past. Nova Scotia demonstrated that kind of resilience repeatedly. Families advocated for accountability. Community members supported one another. Survivors shared their experiences. People came together during anniversaries and memorial events. None of these actions erased grief. But they transformed grief into something constructive. A commitment to memory. A commitment to change. A commitment to ensuring that those who died would not be forgotten. Years after the massacre, many questions have been answered. Investigations reconstructed timelines. The public inquiry examined evidence. Reports documented failures and recommendations. Historians now possess a detailed record of what occurred. Yet certain questions may never receive complete answers. Why does one person choose violence while thousands of others facing difficulties do not? What exact combination of experiences, personality traits, decisions, and circumstances creates a tragedy like this? Could every warning sign have been recognized in time? Could every life have been saved? Human beings naturally seek certainty. Unfortunately, some events resist simple explanations. The Nova Scotia mass shooting remains one of those events. What remains certain is the cost. 22 lives lost. Countless others forever affected. Communities changed. Families altered. A province marked by tragedy. And yet, if there is a final lesson to be found, perhaps it lies not in the actions of the killer but in the lives of the victims. Mass murderers often seek significance through destruction. They force the world to focus on them. They dominate headlines. They become the center of public attention. But history does not have to grant them the final word. The final word can belong to the people they tried to erase. The teachers who inspired students. The healthcare workers who cared for strangers. The neighbors who strengthened communities. The parents who raised families. The friends who brought laughter into ordinary days. The police officer who ran toward danger when others needed protection. Their stories are ultimately more important than his. Their lives mattered more than his violence. Their memories deserve greater attention than his name. And that may be the most meaningful form of justice available. Not forgetting what happened. But refusing to define the victims solely by how they died. Instead, remembering how they lived. Because long after investigations conclude and reports gather dust on shelves, what remains are people. The people who were loved. The people who are missed. The people whose absence is still felt. The story of the Nova Scotia mass shooting begins with violence. But it ends somewhere else. It ends in memory. It ends in resilience. It ends in a promise made by families, communities, and an entire country. A promise that the 22 lives lost in April 2020 will never be reduced to a statistic. A promise that their names will continue to be remembered. And a promise that the lessons written in grief will not be forgotten. For Nova Scotia, the scars remain. For Canada, the lessons remain. And for the victims, remembrance remains. That is where this story ends. And that is where their legacy continues. Years have passed since April 2020. The roads of Nova Scotia are quiet again. The forests remain where they have always been. The ocean still rises and falls along the rugged coastline. Fishing boats continue leaving harbor before sunrise. Children continue growing up in small communities. Families continue gathering around dinner tables. Life, in many ways, has moved forward. That is what life does. It moves forward whether people are ready or not. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. Months become years. The world keeps turning. Yet some events leave marks that time never fully erases. The Nova Scotia mass shooting became one of those events. Not because of the number of headlines it generated. Not because of the investigations. Not because of the inquiries. But because of the people. Because every tragedy is ultimately measured not by statistics but by absence. Absence is what remains when the media coverage ends. Absence is what waits in empty bedrooms. Absence is what appears during holidays. Absence is what sits quietly in family photographs. Absence is what transforms ordinary moments into reminders of loss. A chair that remains unoccupied. A phone number nobody can call anymore. A birthday that arrives each year carrying equal parts memory and sadness. A voice remembered but never heard again. For the families affected by the events of April the 18th and 19th, 2020, these absences became permanent companions. Some learned to live beside grief. Others learned to carry it. Nobody truly escapes it. Loss changes shape over time, but it rarely disappears. In the immediate aftermath of tragedy, people often speak about healing. The word sounds comforting, hopeful, necessary. Yet healing can sometimes create the mistaken impression that pain eventually vanishes. For many survivors, that is not how grief works. Grief evolves. It becomes less sharp, less overwhelming. But it remains. A person simply learns how to continue living while carrying it. This reality can be difficult for outsiders to understand. The public often experiences tragedy through headlines. Families experience it through anniversaries. The public moves on. Families remember. The public reads reports. Families visit graves. The public discusses lessons. Families remember laughter. And perhaps that distinction explains why stories like this matter. Not because they entertain. Not because they satisfy curiosity. But because they remind us that behind every major news event are human beings whose lives continue long after public attention fades. The Nova Scotia tragedy also forced Canadians to reconsider assumptions about safety. For generations, many people believed that events of this scale belonged somewhere else. Another country. Another community. Another place far away. The massacre shattered that illusion. Violence does not always announce itself clearly. Danger does not always look dangerous. Sometimes it appears in familiar places. Sometimes it wears familiar symbols. Sometimes it emerges from people who seem ordinary on the surface. That realization was deeply unsettling. Yet it also carried an important lesson. Awareness matters. Community matters. Paying attention to warning signs matters. Listening to people who report abuse matters. Taking threats seriously matters. The inquiry repeatedly returned to these themes because prevention begins long before a crisis occurs. It begins with recognizing patterns. Recognizing behavior. Recognizing risk. Most acts of extreme violence are preceded by smaller moments that seem insignificant in isolation. A threat. An act of intimidation. An incident dismissed as private. A warning ignored. When viewed individually, these moments may appear unremarkable. Viewed together, they sometimes reveal something far more serious. One of the lasting legacies of Nova Scotia was a broader conversation about domestic violence. Experts, advocates, and survivors emphasized that abuse rarely exists in a vacuum. It affects families, children, communities, workplaces, entire social networks. The massacre became a painful reminder that domestic violence is not merely a private issue. It is a public safety issue, a community issue, a human issue. And perhaps one of the most important lessons to emerge from the tragedy is that intervention matters. Listening matters. Believing people matters. Support systems matter. The cost of ignoring warning signs can be devastating. Yet alongside these difficult lessons exists another side of the story. A side that receives less attention. The side that focuses on courage. Because tragedies reveal not only the worst of human behavior but also the best. Throughout the events of April 2020, Acts of courage appeared repeatedly. People helped one another. Neighbors checked on neighbors. First responders entered uncertain situations. Families supported each other through unimaginable grief. Community members opened their homes and hearts. These actions rarely dominate headlines. They are quieter than violence. But they matter. They reveal something important about human nature. Even in moments of extraordinary darkness, people continue choosing compassion. Continue choosing responsibility. Continue choosing courage. Constable Heidi Stevenson represents one example. Her actions reflected a commitment to service that ultimately cost her life. Yet she was not the only person whose choices demonstrated courage. Many survivors showed courage simply by continuing. Continuing after loss. Continuing after trauma. Continuing after their understanding of the world had been shattered. Sometimes survival itself is an act of courage. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the aftermath is that communities did not allow the tragedy to define them completely. Porter-Peak is still more than a crime scene. Nova Scotia is still more than a headline. The people who live there continue building lives. Children continue attending schools. Families continue celebrating milestones. Communities continue creating new memories. This does not erase the past. Nor should it. But it demonstrates something essential. Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to endure, to rebuild, to remember without remaining trapped. That process is neither quick nor easy. Recovery is not a destination. It is an ongoing journey. A journey that looks different for every person. Some find comfort in advocacy. Others in family. Others in faith. Others in quiet remembrance. There is no single correct way to live after tragedy. There is only the decision to keep living. As we reach the end of this story, it is worth considering what role true crime should play in our understanding of events like these. Too often, the genre risks becoming focused on perpetrators. Their motivations. Their methods. Their identities. The danger of that approach is obvious. The killer becomes the center of the narrative. The victims become secondary. But that is not how this story should be remembered. The most important person in this story is not Gabriel Wortman. The most important people are the 22 individuals whose lives were taken. The teacher whose students still remember lessons learned years ago. The healthcare worker whose kindness helped vulnerable patients. The parents whose children still carry their memories. The friends whose laughter remains part of countless stories. The police officer who answered a call for help. The teenager who should have had decades of life ahead of her. These are the people who deserve remembrance. Because while violence can end a life, it cannot erase a legacy. Legacies survive through stories. Through memories. Through families. Through communities. Through the people left behind. That is why memorials exist. That is why anniversaries matter. That is why names continue to be spoken. Not because society refuses to move forward, but because moving forward does not require forgetting. In fact, meaningful progress often depends upon remembering. Remembering what happened. Remembering what was lost. Remembering the lessons learned. Remembering the people. The Nova Scotia mass shooting remains the deadliest mass shooting in modern Canadian history. That fact will likely appear in history books for generations. Yet history books often reduce tragedies to dates and numbers. April 18 to 19, 2020. 22 victims. 1 offender. A series of locations. A public inquiry. Recommendations. Statistics. But behind every statistic exists a human story. And human stories deserve more than numbers. They deserve empathy. They deserve understanding. They deserve memory. So perhaps the final message of this story is not about violence at all. Perhaps it is about responsibility. The responsibility to listen when people express fear. The responsibility to recognize warning signs. The responsibility to support those experiencing abuse. the responsibility to improve systems when failures become visible, and the responsibility to remember the people whose lives gave those lessons their cost. Because every lesson learned from this tragedy was purchased at an unimaginable price. 22 lives. 22 futures. 22 stories interrupted. Yet not erased. Never erased. As long as their names are remembered. As long as their families continue telling their stories. As long as communities continue honoring their memory. As long as people continue learning from what happened. Their legacy remains. The forests of Nova Scotia still stand. The tides still rise and fall. The roads still wind through small communities along the coast. Life continues. But woven into that landscape is a memory that will endure for generations. A memory of loss. A memory of resilience. A memory of 22 lives that mattered. And in the end, that is how this story should be remembered. Not through the actions of the man who caused the tragedy, but through the lives of the people whose memory outlasted him. Their stories continue. Their impact continues. And their legacy remains.